Hello, ladies, and welcome to our latest lesson. I'm really sorry I can't be with you today, but I am visiting a local primary school, which means that I can't be there in the lesson. It is a revision lesson, which the first part is I'm actually going to be giving you this video that I'm recording now so that we can go through our test papers. So there's our test paper, so you can see it there, the one that you've got. You'll need to come and collect these, please, from down in support. I'll put them on the desk that I normally work at in a pile. Just come and help yourself to your test paper so that you can start to go through it and green pen it using the mark scheme that I provided for you in the Google Classroom, but also the advice that I'm giving you on this video now, where we're talking about things that you've done really, really well, but common errors. And when I'm talking about common errors, I am talking specifically about things that you can change for any question moving forwards. Even though I might give you specific things for this particular test, you need to take on board the bits that actually lots of us have made that mistake. So please take notes as we go through, and I'll try and keep this part of the lesson as short as I possibly can. So let's move straight on to our feedback on the test. So the first thing that I want to start with is, like, generally the marks were really, really good. You ranged from something round about the teens, but most of you were in the 20s, which would indicate a very strong A/B type grade in the exam, right up to, in fact, A star in terms of some of the results that you've got. Questions that you answered really, really well. Question 3 was about the commercialisation of tennis, and most of you understood this idea about commercialisation was about funding, media coverage, sponsorship, professionalism, facilities and coaching, but also participation within sport. And that's really, really important that we take that on board. We seem to know that quite well. In terms of your barriers to taking part, make sure, please, that you do know the individual barriers for each of the 4 groups that we've studied. So we've studied gender, we've studied disability, we've studied race, and we've also studied socioeconomic background. And it's really, really important that you understand areas or barriers that could be very specific to any one of those 4 areas. Yes, we are going to have prejudice and discrimination that are going to occur as the main ones, but be aware about elements of self-esteem, or self-efficacy would be a better word to use. That's self-esteem in a specific situation. Confidence, be aware of self-induced isolation. So it might be that you deem that you're not good enough to play, and therefore you are discriminating against yourself. In terms of disability barriers, make sure that you talk about accessibility. That's a key word, and that could be about transport, or it could be about adapted facilities or adapted equipment. Those would be key areas to look at. And then also be aware that when we're talking about accessibility, we could also be talking about a lack of opportunity through there not being enough competition or specialist clubs, specialist coaches. And it's important when you're talking about these barriers that you are actually identifying the reason and justifying the reason there. So sometimes your answers on the paper, even though we said that this is a strength, sometimes your answers cannot be in depth enough. So make sure you do justify those answers. And then the final area, and again, this is a link here, look, disability came up quite well for question 4. It also came up quite well for question 7, because you understood that disabled participants often face multiple barriers. So we talk about role models, we talk about media coverage. One thing that I think you do need to talk about a little bit more with disability is you need to talk about funding and lack of disposable income. Because remember that groups can be linked together, and nothing like the disability group, because generally you will find within society someone who is disabled perhaps doesn't get the same employment opportunities as someone who isn't disabled, and therefore income can become a barrier itself. Okay, common misconceptions, things that more than one of us got wrong within the class. So let's go through some of the questions where there were common misconceptions. So the first common misconception that I'm going to mention here is about the way in which we read the question and we interpret the command word. This particular question that we've got in front of us now this is an emergence of sport question, but the command word in the statement above is discuss. Now, a discussion means looking at the whole picture. A discussion is about looking at positives and negatives. If the examiner uses the word discussion, they are going to put a ceiling on the marks that you get if you only mention one side of the argument. So, for example, if it's a 4 mark question, the ceiling will generally be a maximum of 3 marks if you talk about positives, or a maximum of 3 marks if you talk about negatives. What that means is you could pick up 3 marks from positives and 1 mark from a negative. You could get 2 and 2, or you could get 1 mark from a positive and 3 different negatives. But you have to mention both sides of the argument. Now, I can tell you, having marked your exam script, there are probably 3, maybe 4 people in the class that only talked about one side of the argument. The word discuss must cover both sides. Typical positive points that you should mention if you're talking about this particular question is funding, facilities, media coverage, sponsorship, the idea of professionalisation within sport, and then the idea of increased participation. Typical negative influences is how the media has interrupted how the game takes place, rule changes that might have taken place, some of them good, some of them not so good. Technology, well, tennis actually, technology has probably been quite a good thing, but in other sports, it might not have been such a good thing. So think particularly about football and the impact that VAR has had on football and the weekly issues that we have there. The mentality that it provides or can start producing if we become a win at all costs attitude, this idea that we're prepared to cheat, that's not a good thing within sport. And then the increased pressure that there is to perform within sport. But having at least one from each of these 2 boxes is really, really important if you're going to be able to access the maximum amount of marks possible. Let's look at another common misconception. So this common misconception was still around question 3, and it's about the way in which we answer our question. So look at the phraseology that we use here. One positive effect is, this impacts lawn tennis by, however, one negative effect is, this impacts lawn tennis by. So look at this. It's a very simple statement. It doesn't need to be paragraphs and paragraphs long. But on this one, if I'd have used these 2 sentences and I'd have justified what's going on, there's 2 marks there. I only have to do this twice. So I could end up with 4 sentences to get me all 4 marks. So it really doesn't have to be, because the word discussion is used, that I end up having to write for 5 minutes, write for 10 minutes. I can do it very, very quickly in this short answer style question. Other common misconceptions that we might have had. Now, this one here, question 4 says, a lack of specialist coaches and equipment and role models can result in low participation rates in sport for people with a disability. Now, reading the question carefully is important. Identify 3 other barriers. So the question has already said specialist coaches, not having the right equipment, not having role models. Too many of you mentioned one of those 3 things or 2 of those 3 things in your answer. You can't do that. The question says you must identify 3 other barriers. So we've got to get rid of this idea of, oh, I'm going to write that answer down there. It's going to get me a mark. I don't understand. Why has that not got me a mark? It hasn't got you a mark because you've already said something in the question that said not to do. If we look at question 4 again, things that we could have used, which might have been better, might have been a lack of adapted facilities, a lack of accessibility around ramping, etc., discrimination or fear of judgment, a lower self-esteem, self-efficacy, a lack of confidence, a lack of opportunity for the performers, and having less media coverage, and the impact that having less media coverage can have on sports. So that could be about sponsorship, not role models. I can't mention role models because it's there in the question. Question 5 then, common misconception. Use an example from sport, describe the term social change. Right, lots of you gave really good definitions. I loved it. It was like your answers were brilliant, textbook. But the thing that you missed about social change, and virtually everybody missed, I think there was perhaps only 2 people got full marks for this question, was the idea that social change takes a long time to take place, or it is a change that takes place over a period of time. So you really have to emphasize this idea that it happens over time. Now look, KAI, what's my knowledge, what's my application, what's my impact? Social change means a change in social behaviours, values, or the order of society. You did that really, really well. Give a sporting example, such as women's football. Most of you chose that type of one. This girl can, as a campaign, or an acceptance of professionalism within sport. So that think about that work that we did at the back end of emergence of sport and how professionalism impacted sport itself. The impact is that change happens over time and it has a long-term effect on society. Here's an example at the bottom of the page of a type of phrase that you could use for this example. Social change is a significant change in society's values or behaviours over time. For example, women's football has become more accepted, shown by increased media coverage, more girls joining clubs. This has had a long-term effect by increasing female participation and challenging traditional gender stereotypes. A strong answer, a really strong answer for getting me maximum marks. How does your answer compare to that? So the extended answer questions, really, I said this is where you need to spend the time, and this is where in your exams you must spend a little bit more time answering the questions. Now there are 2 separate points that I'm going to make to you here. This first point I'm going to make is about using the data that you have in front of you. Now we already looked at this last week when I gave you a sample question at the start of the lesson, and we talked about how we answer extended answer questions. But you've got to refer to the data, and my advice is always refer twice to the data, at least twice within your answer. Don't just leave it as once. So here's an example from question 6. The one thing that's missing from question 6 that you'll need to look on your papers for is the actual table that you're getting the data from. So I've just used the words here, but you'll need to refer to the question. Now, the error that some of you made, lots of you made in question 6, is that you just said men participate more than women. You've got to be more precise. Use facts and figures. So look at my answer at the bottom there of how we could use that data, how I can show that I've used that data. First example I give you, I'm giving you numbers that you'd only get if you'd have looked at the graph or you'd looked at the tabular format. Football shows the largest gender gap, with male participation close to 1.8 million and female participation much lower. So I've used the data from the table where I've seen the 1.8, and I could have quoted the women's participation. I could use the data to make a simple statement like athletics has a smaller gap than football. However, it still has more male participants than female participants. Or I could say tennis has a smaller gender gap than football, suggesting that there are fewer barriers than in football. So all 3 of those statements use the data for me to make a statement. and I'm wanting to make at least 2 within my answer, whether it's an 8 marker or a 15 marker. Think about that magic number of I want to make at least 2, because when we use data, that's an AO2 skill, hence it being in orange on the page. So anytime it says refer to data, anytime it says use data, make at least 2 points. Remember, if it's an 8 marker, there are 3 marks available for AO2. If it's a 15 marker, then there are 5 marks available for AO2. Question 7. The table below, you don't have the table, but you can look in your exam paper, shows the participation data for a disabled and a non-disabled adult over a 4-year period in the London 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Explain the barriers that disabled athletes face and evaluate the effectiveness of strategies to overcome these barriers. Use data in the table above to support your answer. Okay, strongest answers, use the data. The disabled participation fell from 19.1% to 16.8%. Great, you use that mark straight away. Non-disabled participation stayed relatively stable, around 40% participation. This suggests strategies after the Paralympics were not fully effective. Note the bit that I've put in purple. Exam strategy technique. Whenever you get something that talks about data, include at least 2 figures from the graphs or the table that you provided with. So that's about data. This bit is about looking at a specific answer. In question 6 was a synoptic question. We did this synoptic question last week. We talked about it. You as a class are generally much, much stronger at your sociological answers than you were your psychological answers. Now, good common sociological factors were things like the words stereotypes, role models, media coverage, discrimination, lack of clubs, domestic responsibilities. The weaker statements that you made, even though they might have been valid and might have got you marks, were confidence, self-esteem, motivation, and anxiety. Why are they weaker? The language that you're using needs to be better than that. So what should you have learned from the work that you've done so far in psychology? You should have been able to use the word social learning. So Bandura's social learning theory. So the idea that girls would copy role models. Or from a sociological point of view, you could talk about girls would copy their parents, their role models, their peers that are immediately around them in primary socialization. You could have talked about secondary socialization in there as well, and you could have talked about their friendship groups. You could also link that to social learning, which would obviously be psychology. Attitudes. Think about attitudes, but think particularly about how we change attitudes. They're A, B, C. The way in which an attitude can be changed is about changing the cognitive thoughts, changing the behavior itself, and then changing what we actually end up doing in terms of our response to something. Remember to mention about reinforcement. So when we're thinking about good reinforcements, what is there around positive reinforcement that will encourage people to change their habits, to change their lifestyles? Continuing with question 6, because we said that you were better than sociological factors and you were psychological factors. So how do I improve my phrasing around this? Through social learning, girls may observe that football is presented as a male sport, so they're less likely to copy or identify with female performers. This reduces confidence and motivation, especially where there are fewer role models. Notice the language that's been used there to get the AO3 mark. So we've got the key terminology, we've got what we call tier 2 terminology being used, or tier 3 if it's very, very specialist. I might use efficacy as an example of tier 3 language, very specialist to your particular subject. But notice how it's all linked together to get the AO3 mark. Question 6 continued. Okay, Instead of just saying more media coverage would increase role models, we might want to say in the table, we can see that disabled participation fell from 19.1 to 16.8% after the Paralympics, suggesting that there was short-term media coverage was not enough. Media coverage needed to be sustained after major events to have that impact within society. Much stronger evaluative phrase. Other types of evaluations that I could use include things such as funding to improve facilities, specialist equipment, more coaches, more role models, adapted facilities to help access. Now, I have just noticed an error as I've been presenting here. These last two slides should just say question 7, not question 6. So there is an error as I'm presenting. Obviously, I'm talking about question 7, not question 6 in my answers here. So those last two slides, please apply them to question 7, not question 6. The rest of your work for today's lesson is actually available on the Google Classroom. And I'm going to show you the Google Classroom here. Here it is, just as I'm about to put it out now on Tuesday evening. I'll assign it for 6 o'clock Wednesday morning so that it's available to you. Things that you need to do is you're going to need to go on this YouTube video that I've shared with you. The YouTube video, you want to start it an hour and 10 minutes in, just so that you can watch the stuff that's specific to my element of the course. You've got a revision pack that's available to you specifically from 1 minute 17 onwards. I chose not to give you the bit for the first 7 minutes. I'm sure you can just take notes for that bit. You've also got the mark scheme available to you here in the Google Classroom for the exam paper that you're going to be working through. And you've got an Everlearner checkpoint to do. Mariella, Evie, Emma. Okay, let's make sure that we are doing those checkpoints, please, as part of our revision. Look forward to seeing you after the exams, ladies. I'd love to wish you luck, but luck doesn't come into it. Okay, if you prepare perfectly, you will get a great result. If you don't prepare perfectly, please don't expect to get a perfect result. Okay, so perfect preparation prevents poor performance. So it's all about the way in which you prepare. Luck does not come into this, ladies. I will see you all in a couple of weeks' time.